who would like to speak?
I think that by the time you employ a security team to audit something, you only discover them. You will not remove them. You will just get a list and say, this is what's wrong.
Yeah. So this is going back to what I said before about, are you focusing on finding and fixing, or are you actually preventing, right? And actually to kind of pose another question on the topic of compliance, and when we look at standards like PCI and the mandated requirement for coverage of, say, OWASP or SANS, and the earlier point about point solutions, how would we holistically apply this to the software process? Picking out that top 10 list, for example, where does each of these bugs originate from? Where would you, for example, some of the bugs around session management, how do those get into your application to begin with? I mean, a lot of that would come maybe from Spring, for example, right? So you wouldn't write that stuff yourself, you'd build it on top of, something that is architecturally secure. I mean, how would you, how do you optimize that process?
I think we live in a world of trade-offs that make it very difficult to work out what is the best approach, because clearly if you can identify and remove vulnerabilities, that probably reduces your risk footprint. But how do you prioritize which of those vulnerabilities? How do you determine whether changing code is actually introducing other weaknesses? Where does the cost lie? I mean, what I'm quite fascinated at as someone outside of the profession of development is you have remarkably little data. It's been fantastic to hear data this evening that I hadn't heard before. But whenever I look into any part of this, there's this study IBM did in sort of 1978 that said that code costs 100 times as much to remove a bug in production than it does in development. And you kind of think, I think software development's changed a bit since then.
I hope so.
And yet I don't see any updates to those studies. I don't see a measure of what is the right answer. Is it better to put in another layer that defends against this? How do we deal with the issue that some of the code we find bugs in, we can't fix that code. It comes from the supply chain. It is the horse meat fed into our burgers. It is stuff we don't have the support contracts. We don't have this capability. So we can't fix everything. So what do we do instead? And I think that it doesn't mean we shouldn't try and fix things. We definitely should try and make things better from the start. But I think, to your point, you can't get to perfection. So what do we do next? How do we layer the right set of controls? And the only way to make good risk decisions is to have good risk data. And very few people, I think, have brilliant risk data about simple things like what is the best development framework to use. It's a religious argument rather than an evidence-based informed one. We don't see good data that tells us people following this framework produce more secure code. Until we do, I think picking off individual vulnerabilities is a great way for auditors to keep busy and everyone to look like they've done some patching and fixing and prioritization. But we're not fixing the core of the problem, I don't think.
I mean, one thing I'd like to see would be a security framework that doesn't let you produce insecure code.
So you made some very interesting points there, and Tim, you did as well. Also, Tim, given your background, I think this question is going to be quite interesting. If you consider how efficient it is to deploy a security auditing team, now employing a security auditing team, that phrase alone to me is a big problem in the security industry today, in that a lot of people view security as a bunch of checkboxes. In other words, the traditional approach to security, or should we say the approach to security I see the most, is one of compliance and not one of managing risk. In other words, I understand that in the PCI world you need compliance because there's very little other way to measure that. But for instance, at a bank or in an enterprise scenario, you have a lot of security professionals who will tick off a list of, have you done this, have you done this, have you done this? And that isn't, I think, a pragmatic way to approach this. It's more a case of, have you developed a risk model? What are the actual risks to your software? Should we even be bothering with things like cross-site scripting, preventing cross-site scripting? Or, have you got a decent authentication protocol in place? It's interesting that most security professionals I work with don't even know what an authentication protocol should look like or how to actually write one down. What are your sort of feelings on that whole question around risk versus compliance?
Sorry.
So I would be amazed if your security function wasn't doing some kind of risk-based prioritization. Absolutely for us, we divide our application estate up by a number of different parameters. One of them is whether it's externally facing or exchanging data with other external systems. And absolutely, those go right to the top of the list in terms of things like cross-site scripting or SQL injection. Those kind of very accessible. I'm kind of amazed at some of your statements. That does not sound like a well-run security function. We're absolutely about trying to do all of those things. One of my other responsibilities is around security architecture. So we absolutely try and get into every single design. Not just saying how you're doing authentication, we're actually saying here are the authentication or authorization or access recertification solutions we have in place in our organization. And we want you to use one of those because it's set up, it works, it runs, it's all secure. Here's how you integrate with it, etc. If you want to do something else because you have some other requirement, great. But now we have to go back to first principles to go through and make sure that that's all correct. So I agree with what you're saying. I'm just really surprised that your organisation is not doing that. I think that's standard for financial services.
Well, I think the issue I'd say is the brilliance of a good checklist is that relatively unskilled individuals can achieve a level of competence which they wouldn't achieve without that guidance. So if you want to scale to millions of, I am generally, I used to work in industry, I hated compliance frameworks because it was a tech box exercise. And I looked at the rollout of PCI DSS, but for most organizations who were below that standard, they didn't have to hire expensive guidance. They didn't have to have people as brilliant as you on their team to get to a reasonable point. It wasn't enough, but it was better. So if standards are so low and you set the compliance checklist at the right level, you can make real progress. And that the challenge becomes when you want to go beyond that and do something interesting and different, and people apply the wrong checklist or believe that by having checked these boxes we're perfectly safe. So I think that there's something quite powerful about the repeatability, the scalability, the ability to feed back. One of the challenges of getting an audit review is what used to really annoy me was auditors would come and they'd tell me there's 10 things wrong with this application. There's 10 things wrong with this access list. And they would never let me know if the first 11 things they checked had found 10 things wrong, or they checked 10,000 things and found 10 things wrong. And for me, they're very different points about how effective and mature my process is, how repeatable it is, if I have a very small error rate or a very large error rate. But every time you do an audit, you find 10 vulnerabilities. And how you get the risk level to determine which ones are critical, you can't get the skills, so let's use checklists that get us forward.